Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Lisa Bader, the Program Director for Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods. And thank you for joining us for tonight's presentation about the California Serengeti with Breck Parkman. So this meeting is set up so we can't see or hear you in the audience, but you can communicate with us through the chat. And you'll be asking questions in the chat feature as well. And for most of you, that's probably on your bottom toolbar. And to see this the best, because Breck has a great slideshow, we suggest that you set your view to speaker view, which you can do at the top right setting on your screen where it says view, and you can go to speaker view. And this is being recorded. We'll post the recording on our website, and you'll be able to watch it on our YouTube channel and share it with the people who weren't able to make it, or if you want to slow it down and go back over some of it, that'll be available for you. Thank you very much, Breck, for encouraging us to record this. We really appreciate that. So the presentation will go on for about an hour. There'll be about 20 minutes for questions at the end, and then we're scheduled to finish around 8:30. And for the Q&A, you can put your questions in the chat box at the bottom, and then I'll ask them of Breck at the end in the Q&A period. For those of you just learning about Stewards, Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods is a nonprofit located here in Sonoma County, California. And our mission is to protect the natural and cultural resources of Armstrong Redwoods State Natural Reserve, Austin Creek State Recreation Area, and Sonoma Coast State Park through volunteerism, environmental education, and stewardship for generations to come. You can find out more about us through our website, stewardscr.org. And now we are very happy to welcome Breck Parkman, retired senior state archaeologist with California State Parks. And Breck will tell you a little bit about himself. Take it away.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. What a great night. I've been looking forward to this. I assume that some of you are participating with laptops and PCs, and others are on iPads, and probably many are on your smartphones. Because of the slides I have, it's best to see it on the biggest screen possible. So on an iPad, laptop, or PC. You'll be able to follow along, and I think you'll probably see plenty with your smartphone. But if you're on the smartphone and you do want to go back later and look at the YouTube video, you'll probably get more out of it, seeing it a second time, if you feel like you're missing anything. Anyway, I called this the California Serengeti, this talk, and some of you have heard me do this before. I've done it 4 or 5 times in recent years. And the second title is Exploring Late Pleistocene Ecosystems in the Russian River Watershed and Beyond. I want to tie it into the Russian River Watershed and beyond for reasons I'll make clear at the end of this talk. So this is so exciting. Let me hang on just a minute. I'm having trouble advancing it. All right. I'm going to have to go to.
I don't know if you can use your arrow key to advance it or not.
That's what I usually use, and they're not advancing. So am I just sharing this one page, or will it moved though when you and I were just doing it? Hold on, we'll figure this out really fast. I'm trying to. Oops. Now, hold on. Whoops. Well, this is embarrassing, but we'll figure this out.
No, it's okay. I know how the controls.
I'm trying to minimize so I can find where I see all my slides again. And speaker. Where the heck are my slides? Okay. I'm about, okay, there we go. Can you see the slides now?
We can definitely see the slide. There we go.
Okay, good. I don't know how
Perfect.
that happened. It's
No
probably
worries.
the weather, or it's all the craziness in our world. Anyway, here I am. My name is Breck Parkman. I worked for state parks for almost 40 years. I've been an archaeologist for over 50 years. And I can't imagine having done anything in my life other than what I've done. And it's been a great career. And it's not over yet. I retired 7 years ago from the state, but I'm still as busy as ever. Um, I've worked all through California. I've worked all over the world. I've worked on 5 continents, and I have a lot of stories. And I started out thinking I was a scientist, but along the way I realized, no, actually, I'm a storyteller. So tonight I'm going to tell some stories. Um, as an archaeologist, I've seen some really cool things. And every archaeologist in this room, whether you're a student or a professional, you know what I mean. There's something about doing archaeology around the world that you discover things, and you discover that it doesn't have to be made out of gold or, a million years old to be important. I'm doing mostly contemporary archaeology these days. So I'm interested in the Grateful Dead and hippies and mid-century resorts and things like that. And there's still so much we can learn. But as an archaeologist, I always wanted a time machine, because you always have questions. What would it be like to go back? Like California Serengeti. Could you imagine if we could really go back 18,000 years and see what life was like here? So I always wanted a time machine. But I saw H.G. Wells the time, or I read the book, and I later saw the movie, and it scared the heck out of me, because if you go too far into the future, you don't know what you're going to find. In this case, in the movie, it was the Morlocks. And as a kid growing up, those used to really scare me. So we're not going to go into the future right now, but we are going to go into the past, because that's what I told Lisa and Justin I talk about. We're going to take the time machine. And although there really isn't a time machine, I do actually have one. And we're going to go back 18,000 years. And you might say, why 18,000 years? Well, 18,000 years ago correlates with the last glacial maximum. And that's a term that scientists use to describe that time in our past when the glaciers were the most extensive and the polar ice caps were the most advanced, and the ocean was the lowest, because everything was locked up in ice. And the ocean actually was about 400 feet lower than it is today. So imagine if you drop the ocean around the world 400 feet, what that would mean. And we'll talk a little bit about that. 18,000 years ago was when it was still really cold. There was snow, maybe not in our area, but you had to go up to the Sierras to see glaciers. And then after that, the world began to warm a bit, and then more and more and more. The ice melted, the ocean came up, and along the way, we lost a lot of our megafauna. Things like the mammoth and the bison and the camels and all died out. So we're going to go back and see that. To go back, we have to get into time machine. I understand from Lisa that you all signed the waivers, so we should be really good to go. And what would we see? Well, we'd see the California Serengeti. And we see something like this. This is a photo I took of the last group I took out Sonoma Coast. And those are actual animals, at least in our minds. We saw this. And you can see it too. And hopefully by the time the night's over, you'll have seen the mammoth. And we'll see. California Serengeti is a term I just came up with 24 years ago to try to describe what I was seeing on the Sonoma Coast, and then later elsewhere in North America. The Serengeti, after the Serengeti of East Africa, the Serengeti Plains, which is a fabulous area for understanding landscape and the interaction of animals and predators and prey. I grew up reading National Geographic and always wanted to go to the Serengeti Plains. I've yet to get there. Someday I will. But right here in Sonoma County, I discovered the next best thing. And that's the Serengeti I call the California Serengeti, which is what our area was like at the last ice age. So here's something we'd see. Can you imagine seeing a Columbian mammoth in Sonoma County if you went back 18,000 years ago? Or even 13,000 years ago, that's what you would see. Look at the size of that. Now, the mammoths came over from Asia just under 2 million years ago. We may discover someday that they came earlier in that, but based on those who have been found and have been dated, we think that the mammoths have been in North and South America, North America especially, just under 2 million years. And they were gone by about 11,000 years ago. There are people talking about trying to bring them back. I'm not sure how you feel about that cloning. I have mixed feelings about it. I think it would be kind of sad for the animals that come back, unless you made a lot of them and gave them a big space. But here are some of the other animals that we would see if truly we took a time machine tonight and went back. Look at that. Some of those are still around. The elk's still here. You can see wolves in part of the world, but a lot of those animals, saber-tooths and the short-faced bear and the dire wolves, the giant ground sloths, they're gone. But they were here not that long ago, and their remains are represented in the fossils that are at places like the Berkeley Museum of Paleontology and at UCLA and La Brea tar pits. There's been lots of fossils found in Sonoma County. And over the years, I've tried to plot them out to better understand where the animals were, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. But here's one of my new favorite animals. I can't see it because all of our names are blocking the right side of my screen, but I'll move the mouse in the right direction. It's this critter over here in the lower right corner. Can you see that? What do you think that is? Anyone who knows what that is, raise your hand. And if you say a beaver, you're right. But it's the giant beaver. Now, who's heard of the giant beaver? We all heard of the modern beaver. We've all heard of Justin Bieber, but this was the giant beaver, which is now extinct. Look how big that was. There's something about size in the Ice Age where a lot of animals, and this beaver, if it stood up on its hind legs, was about 5 feet tall. I kind of wonder what type of trees was it cutting down? Redwoods, maybe? Probably not redwoods. But a lot of the animals back then were really large. Looking at this graphic in the upper left, we see a saber-tooth cat. A lot of people call it the saber-tooth tiger, but it's not a tiger, it's a cat, saber-tooth cat. We see the short-faced bear, another of my favorites. We see the American lion. Did you know we had lions? I mean, true lions in North America? The black bear is actually a black bear in comparison to a large black bear. And then we have in the upper right, a longhorn bison, which we had right here in Sonoma County. There was a fossil, I believe it was a skull or maybe a skull and a horn, found on the JC campus back in the 1920s when they were developing some of the campus structures. And then lower right, we have the really big guy is an imperial mammoth that lived on the Siberian steppes. And in the middle, we have the Columbian mammoth, which we had here. And we had the woolly mammoth, which we didn't have here. The woolly mammoths were further inland in colder environments. And here's our American lion. The American lion looked a lot like the African lion we think of today, but it was larger, a third larger than what we see today. And the short-faced bear. That bear, believe it or not, when it stood up on its hind legs, could stand between 10 and 13 feet tall. Now imagine that. And the question I would ask is, what did a short-faced bear eat? And the answer is anything it desired. There's a short-faced bear standing on that little platform there. And just imagine encountering that bear. It's a testament to the people that lived with it, the indigenous people of Europe and North America and South America, and I think North Asia, there were some. And imagine living in a neighborhood with that bear and not feeling compelled to go out and wipe it out, but living in grace with it. And that's what a lot of indigenous people did. They lived in grace with these animals. They learned how to be with them. Here's that longhorn bison. Look at that. As big as a Volkswagen, bigger actually. Now, this bison went extinct about 27,000 years ago. But we had another one, and you can see this one right here that survived up until 11,000 years ago. And today we have bison, the historic bison, which is this one lower right. Our historic bison today, and if you've been to Yellowstone, you've seen them, has a shoulder height of about 6 feet, which means it's a tremendously large animal. But bison antiquus that we had all through our area up until about 11,000 years ago stood 7 feet tall. And bison latifrans, this extinct bison from earlier, stood 8 feet at the shoulder. I can't imagine that. And we had the giant ground sloth, as you can see here. Years ago, I got called up to Lake Oroville to the forebay to look at a discovery had been made, a fossil discovery. And I went, and in my notebook, I said, this is obviously a Miocene whale. It's a whale that has died here and become fossils because the bones were so big and long and extended. We took some down to Berkeley to identify to see what type of whale this was. And it turned out it was a giant ground sloth. And it wasn't as big as it looked. It was still really big, but the bones had disarticulated and it kind of fooled me. But a giant ground sloth was a really, really big animal. And we had them here feeding off of our trees. And who would believe we had camels? This camel in the middle, yesterday's camel, or Camelops histernus, was the camel that we had here until about 10,000 years ago. And we find them at La Brea Tar Pit, and their fossils have been found in the Bay Area. This is a modern camel over here on the right. Now, this camel up here lived during the Miocene, early Pleistocene, so it's long gone, but it was 11 feet at the shoulder. Can't imagine that. That's getting up like some of the big dinosaurs, but it was a mammal. And we had horses out on the Serengeti plains. A lot of people don't realize that this is where the horse originated and then walked to North Asia when the land bridge was available. As the ocean went down, a piece of land connecting North Asia and North America became passable. And it was actually more than a bridge. At the height, it was over 1,000 miles wide. It was a big piece of land. And horses and camels and their kin left North America and went to North Asia. And at the same time, the mammoth and the bison and quite possibly people were moving this direction. And animals and people went back and forth whenever it was possible. But here's the horse that we used to have. And then the birds. I'm not going to talk too much about birds tonight because I'm still exploring what it would have been like. But what I do know is out on the California Serengeti, the sky would have been filled with birds, and your ears would have been filled with birdsong and screeching and all the sounds that birds make. There would have really been a lot of birds here. And they would have been resident birds feeding off the grasslands and the trees, and they would have been migratory birds passing through, looking for pools of water, lagoons, or whatnot. Would have been something to see. The big critters, though, are some of my favorite. And this slide compares the mastodon to the mammoth. And a lot of people get these two mixed up. And I don't know a lot about mastodons. I've been studying mammoths for years, but we had both in our area. I do know that the mammoth was considerably larger than the mastodon and had an overlapping diet. The mammoth was more of a grazer, and the mastodon was a browser, and which means it was eating leaves and twigs and grass and sedge. The mammoth kind of preferred grazing on grasses and sedges and things like that. But in a pinch, depending on where it lived, not here, but elsewhere, it could eat other things if need to. But it liked grass and sedge, and that's part of the story coming up in just a bit, the fact that they ate grass and sedge. Now, a lot of people assume that we had the woolly mammoth. I can only see part of this woolly mammoth because my photo is taking up half of the mammoth. But you can see the Columbian mammoth on the left, and you can see the woolly mammoth on the right. Both lived in North America. But in our area, we just had the Columbian mammoth. It wasn't cold enough here for the woolly mammoths to hang around. You find them in Montana and South Dakota and Colorado. You find them up in Siberia and Alaska and northern Canada, where it was colder. And I try to think about trying to explain to people what happened. I imagine our Columbian mammoths coming to California and saying, my gosh, this is well, scientists call California a refugium during the Ice Age. It was a place of refuge that wasn't that harsh versus the ice and snow inland, the really cold temperatures inland. If you're on the coast, it was pleasant. It still is today. When it's really hot inland, it'll be a cool place to go. and it stays warm in the wintertime, doesn't freeze like it does up at Tahoe and all. So the mammoths came, and even if they had had fur like the woolly mammoths, they would have probably shed it. They didn't actually do that. They arrived without the fur coats, but if they had, they'd have taken them off because California was, it still is a pretty cold place. I don't know that they surfed, but they hung out on the coast. I know that. I've seen their remains. So this is what impressed me as a kid reading National Geographic, the Serengeti Plains. And whoever's in the audience, have you been to the Serengeti Plains? Raise your hand. A few of you. Well, someday I would like to go and just see that before there's nothing to see. And hopefully there'll always be something to see. But as development comes to East Africa, there could be less and less to see. And here's our California Serengeti, 18,000 years ago. I know some scientists that say the East African Serengeti of 100 years ago was spectacular, but East African Serengeti of Pleistocene times was much richer. And those same scientists will say our Serengeti, what I call the California Serengeti, was even richer still. If that's true, it means that what we had here 18,000 years ago rivaled anything in the world for the spectacular nature of all of these animals moving together, living together, feeding together, and sometimes feeding on each other. And this is just an artistic rendition of what we might be seeing right now in our trip back to the California Serengeti. What you're seeing out there, you're seeing mostly bison and mammoths. I don't think I see any predators in this painting. But speaking of predators, when I envision the California Serengeti, I envision a big soccer game between predators and prey animals, especially herbivores. And there was this 24/7 competition going on between, on one side, the predators, and on the other side, the herbivores and prey animals. One side wants to eat the other, and it's a competition that goes on and on and on. And because the animals existed and they survived for so long, I think the teams were pretty equally balanced, not in numbers of players, but in strength and power. What I did years ago, and this is what I mean by the teams, years ago, I wrote up a report in which I tried to predict what our optimum carrying capacity was for the greater San Francisco Bay Area 18,000 years ago. And I looked at the Serengeti Plains during historic times. I looked at the American Great Plains during historic times, the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, and some of the other places around the world I'd seen or studied. And I came up with some numbers. And for example, I assume we had one big short-faced bear for every 3,000 hectares. And what's a hectare? Hectare is like 7,000 acres, I think. And one dire wolf for 3,500 hectares, and a saber-tooth cat for 3,000 hectares. So I started crunching numbers based on the acreage of this area that I was studying, that I call the California Serengeti. The only important number here is the one I've got the red arrow to at the bottom here, 140 to 1. What I came up with, and I'm pretty sure it's a good number, is that for every one big predator, like a short-faced bear or dire wolf or saber-tooth cat, we had 140 large prey animals, megafauna, horses, camels, bison, mammoths, ground sloths. So about 140 to 1. And when I look at the fossils that we've found, it kind of reflects that. When we look at fossils that have been found in the Bay Area, Pleistocene fossils, they tend to be horse and bison, occasionally a mammoth, rarely a predator, but there's some out there. That's kind of exciting. I've had people say, well, prove it. How do you know there was, this many mammoths here? I think there was I figured about 750 mammoths in the greater Bay Area at any one time, maybe as many as 4 million during the past, living, 50, 60 years an animal in herds of 7 to maybe 20 animals. People have said, prove that. And I can't prove it. I've created a question, and other people can prove or disprove it. So if anyone wants to prove or disprove it, be at it. I'd love it, regardless of what you find out. But it still comes to a lot of animals because this was a beautiful, luxurious, plentiful environment. This is what I call the Farallon Plain. It's mostly underwater now. This is half of the Serengeti, California Serengeti. And it's the area that's now underwater that 18,000 years ago was dry. Because remember when all the ice melted and the glaciers restricted and reduced themselves and the polar ice caps dried up, that melting water went into the ocean and raised the ocean about 400 feet. And as the ocean came up, it inundated this large coastal plain. And you see this around the world. Florida, during the Ice Age, you could walk a long ways, or from the UK, you could walk long ways into the North Sea. It's all now underwater. So the Farallon Plain is this area about 1.7 million acres. And on my map, I show it going from the Monterey Canyon, Monterey Bay, north to northern Sonoma, Mendocino County. And there you are right there. That's what it looked like. Now, here's the funny thing a lot of people don't realize. 18,000 years ago, you could walk to the Farallon Islands, or you could walk to the Cordell Bank and go fishing. Can't do that now. That's like a 30-something mile boat ride. And probably some of you have done that. I've done that. It's a long boat ride. But 18,000 years ago, you could walk out there. And this is sort of an artistic rendition of what it looked like. So the Farallon Plain is the area that's no longer available to us. But there it is. Here it is again. And this shows as the ice melted and the ice age came to a conclusion for now, because we're in between them, the ocean came up slowly. And we see here where the beach would have been 20,000 years ago and 14,000 and 13,000. San Francisco Bay, during the time I'm talking about, 18,000 years ago, was a big, well-watered valley, grassy valley with savanna, trees along streams and all. It's now San Francisco Bay. What happened? Well, as the ocean rose, it inundated this valley that we now call San Francisco Bay, but scientists call it the Franciscan Valley when it was dry. So here's the Farallon Plains again. If you stand out here on the coast, you only see a sliver of dry land. That was this western part of the Serengeti, but you see the ocean. And in this particular photo here, you'd have to go about 12 miles out to find the beach 18,000 years ago. But what you really see is you see these rocks, I call mammoth rocks. In 2001, a survey partner and I, Raj Naidu, looked at these rocks over here. Rock climbers call these sunset rocks. I've called them mammoth rocks over the years, and we found a unique polish on them. And over the years, I've studied that polish quite diligently, and I've come to the conclusion that the polish I see on these rocks was made by megafauna during the Ice Age. And I'd worked up in northern Canada with the Northern Cree people looking at what they called the Buffalo Rocks, and I'd seen a lot of polished rocks up there. And I've corresponded with friends, scientists that are working in East Africa who see polish on the elephant rocks over there. So it wasn't like this brilliant idea that this is polish, animal polish, but what was unique is that some of the polish was 13 feet above the ground. And horses and cattle and sheep that still polish rocks don't get up 13 feet. So that began this long process of studying, for me, the Ice Age and mammoths and everything in between, which is why we're here tonight. Well, because it's mammoths, people love elephants and people love mammoths. When the word got out what I was doing, there was a lot of media attention. So I was out there with Huell Hauser. He really wanted to do a special. If you ever get a chance to see Huell's show about it. And then here I am with Alice Roberts from BBC. They did a really nice documentary about the Ice Age, and they included this. And there's been so much more. So how does this polish work? And why do I think it's megafauna, especially mammoths? Here's a contemporary photograph of some mammoths enjoying a mud bath. Now, an African elephant and a Columbian mammoth did not sweat like you would expect to sweat. So they had to get wet every day. Also, they like wallowing in the mud, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But here they are wallowing in the mud. But if you have a water source, a pond or a water hole, and you have a herd of mammoth or elephants getting in it every day, it's going to become a muddy mess, obviously, because of their size. And that's what you see here. And then today, you can see elephants in East Africa. They'll get muddy and they'll wait a little while and they'll look at their watch every now and then. And when it's the right time, they'll amble over to a rock like this, or termite mound, or the side of someone's home, and they rub the mud off because the mud now has become encased and it's becoming hard. And they wait just at the right time and they rub it all off. There's a reason they're doing that. And it's partly part of a daily grooming behavior. Bison do it also. Here's one of the bison rocks up in Canada. And I saw a bunch of these, and some were still being used 200 years ago, and you can still see the trough around the rocks where the bison walked and walked and walked. And even domestic cattle do this. This was down in Marin County, photo I took of domestic cattle rubbing rocks to figure out if there was any chance this truly was mammoth polish or bison polish. I asked two friends of mine, both of whom are gone now, Steve Norick and Rolf Erickson, two of the leading geologists in Northern California, to look at it. And so we worked together and we used a scanning electron microscope and atomic force microscope. We did a lot of real science, more than just my storytelling. And we didn't prove that this was mammoth polish, but we disproved all the other possibilities that we were aware of. We compared this polish, the polish on known elephant rocks in Africa and rubbing post in zoos, and it's very similar. We see all of these similarities. So I'm 97, 98, 99% certain this is mammoth polish, but as a scientist and abiding by the scientific method, I will still say it's a hypothesis until I can prove it. And I can only prove it by doing biochemistry, and I've done some of that, but not enough, or by going back in a time machine. So maybe we'll prove it tonight. So how does it work? Well, this is a lot of you probably used to have, or maybe still have, these old rock tumblers. I have one right now in the garage. And you take the rocks and you put them in the tumbler and you start using early on clays and then polishing agents. And by the end of the month, you have these beautiful polished rocks. Mammoth rocks is just one of about 17 I'm aware of on the coast. This is called jasper rock. It's a few miles away. It's a red chert or jasper rock. And look at the polish here. That's like the polish that comes out of my rock tumbler. And that was done by mammoths or bison. To explore this site, we did a large excavation, we being myself and Santa Rosa Junior College 20 years ago. And we excavated a large pit beside the rock. And we went down actually 14 feet. But we had polish on the rock going 6 feet below the surface. And then this rock's about 8 feet at the top. So we could see the polish going down in time. And then what was kind of fun is I did some radiocarbon dating. And the lower part where the polish started to end, I dated it about 20,000 years ago using organics in the soil. But I also found that people had been quarrying, real people, had been quarrying this stone to make tools out of, especially around 9,000 years ago. Now, that didn't surprise me because there's another site nearby that we dated at about 9,000 years, making it the oldest known site in our area up here on the coast. But down there where I had that 20,000-year-old date, I have what I think is evidence of stone quarrying. Haven't proven it yet, but I'm getting there, which means that we may have had people living here at least 20,000 years ago. Saying that used to would have gotten me in trouble because everybody said, no, people have been in North America 13,000 years, so more or less. We really don't know a lot about those earliest people. I think their evidence is actually out under the water on the coast. I think that's why we're not seeing a lot of the old sites. They're inundated or deeply buried. But in recent years, we've seen evidence that people were here a lot earlier than 13,000 years ago. Seems like every day now we see more and more scientific evidence that people have been here for longer and longer. And as time goes on, as the decades become centuries, if we're still interested, I'm sure scientists will still be finding older and older sites. So what were the mammoths doing out on the coast? Why were they going out there? Did they live there? They didn't live there. The California Serengeti had pastures, and they had there were winter pastures and there were spring summer pastures, kind of like what happens on the Serengeti plains today of Africa. If you have a lot of mammoths and bison living in one area, they will spoil the area before long. They have to move about. So think about this. We have a Mediterranean climate, and in the summer it gets particularly hot. Winters are cool. In the old days, during the Ice Age, we didn't have all these yellow grasses. These are mostly exotics that came in during historic times. Our grasses were more shimmering blue and green, but when it got really hot, like it did here today, they still got dry and desiccated. And to the taste buds of a mammoth or a bison, they weren't very tasty. Well, they had learned from their grandmothers and grandfathers years earlier to move out to the coast when the feed got desiccated. And that's why you would go out to the coast. And why would you go to the coast to feed? Because of the fog. Even on hot days inland, the coast, just like it is today, was cooler and often foggier. And the pastures, the graze material, the grasses and sedges, was more lush and tasty. And that was enough to create this seasonal migration from east to west, back and forth. And as the mammoth went, the bison went, and the camels went, and the horses went. And as the prey animals went, the lions and their dire wolves and the short-faced bears went. So there was this cyclical seasonal migration from interior to the coast, back and forth. I've looked at some of our highway systems and where some of the fossils are found, and I can see a couple of the migration corridors. The Russian River is one of them, for sure. There's one also that goes out Bodega Highway, I think the Occidental. But the Russian River was probably our main passage. Now, during the Ice Age, the Russian River was about 125 feet lower, the bed of the river at Bridgehaven, than it is today, because the river had to go another 12 miles further out to sea. And imagine herds of animals moving back and forth. Today, a lot of the roads in Africa originated as elephant roads. And people used the elephant roads, and eventually they claimed them as their own and paved them and made them highways. We probably have the same thing here. Highway 12 through the Valley of the Moon is almost certainly a mammoth road, give or take a few hundred yards. And Highway 1 from Fort Ross down to Bodega is probably another. Now here's the Bay Area. I said that the Russian River was the big migration route for a lot of what we had going on up in our area. But if you look at the California Serengeti, it was bigger than Sonoma County. And the major corridor was the Golden Gate. So you see the Farallon Plains out here in the water and the Golden Gate here. Looking the other way, you can see the inundated Franciscan Valley, which we now call San Francisco Bay. But look at this. When they built the Bay Bridge, when they were doing the caissons, they hit a lot of fossils. And in recent years, they went in to do some more work on it, and they hit more fossils. And some of the animals that were found in the Bay Bridge caissons include the horse, the bison, and the mammoth. When they did the Alameda Tube, they found a whole bunch of animals: the camel, sloth, bison, bear, mammoth, in the sediments, sometimes 200 feet down into the silt under the bay. They found these animals. So the Franciscan Valley, which we now know as San Francisco Bay, must have been a teeming environment for Rancho La Brea and megafauna and all the animals associated. And again, moving east to west, making this migration. Summertime out on the coast, wintertime in the interior valleys. Now, my California Serengeti is about 3 million acres in size if you take the coastal part, which I call the Farallon Plain, and the interior part, which I call the Franciscan Valley. And the Franciscan Valley, according to my maps, goes from just north of Cloverdale south to San Juan Bautista. And the Farallon Plains goes from up near Anchor Bay, northern Sonoma County, down to Monterey Bay. But what about the Great Central Valley? I haven't really taken that on yet. If you take into account the Central Valley, there's lots of mammoth fossils and bison fossils found in the valley. If they were also migrating, they would have passed through the Golden Gate also, and it would greatly enlarge what was going on here. In addition to San Francisco, or in addition to the Golden Gate, I've been looking at these passes, the Altamont Pass, Chaco Pass, but I haven't looked at the fossils yet to see if we can see, movement or postulated movement through there. It's kind of something to look at in the future. I've also been looking at the fossil botanical environment. Here's my colleague Raj, and this is the west parking lot at Bodega Head. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this little beach here. Back in 2005, I salvaged the remains of a Sitka spruce tree there. And Raj was actually the first to find it. He told me, there's some cones coming out of the cliff. So a big winter storm was coming in. I was thinking I should go and see if there's anything coming out. And I found this tree. There was a Sitka spruce tree sideways, and we salvaged what we could before the storm came in. This is some of the wood. It's old wood, but it still looks like wood. It hasn't carbonized yet, certainly hasn't fossilized. And we found cones. On the left are two modern Sitka spruce cones, and on the right are three fossil Sitka spruce cones from Bodega Head. And in fact, I found 33 or 34 cones, and these are down at the Museum of Paleontology now. It was one of the most southern discoveries of Sitka spruce in California. Today, to see a Sitka spruce forest, you have to go up to the northwest coast. There's a little island of Sitka spruce in northern Mendocino County, but otherwise, you've got to get up into the Cascades and the northwest. What was that doing there? Well, that's a good question. If you walk along the trail at Bodega Head, and look down and do it safely, don't fall. But if you look down, about 50 feet down the cliffs, you'll see some little dark pieces of trees sticking out. And those are fossil trees. There's all types of trees out there, and you can't really get to them. I got two of them when I was doing my study only because I enlisted the rangers who were going to be doing some cliff rescue. And I said, while you're doing it, can you grab some specimens for me? So that's what they're doing. And you can see a little tree sticking out here. That's Jeremy Stinson, who used to work on our coast. Some of you probably remember Jeremy. There was also a pine cone found out at Bodega Head in the 50s, in Monterey pine, which we consider exotic in our area today, but they were very common, during the Ice Age, especially on the Marin coast. So working with some of the things like that pine cone and some of the Sitka spruce pieces, I had them radiocarbon dated down at the Lawrence Livermore lab. And there are my dates there. They're all right around 50,000 years old. There's one date that's an anomaly. It dates one date 35 and next time 45. I think that's an error. So for the most part, all of this wood out there is right around 48, 52,000 years old. So it's stretching the limits of what you can do with radiocarbon. Interesting, though, to think that 50,000 years ago, we had Sitka spruce, Monterey pine in our coastal forest. Now the vernal pools. And this is where I look at my big clock. I think I'm still on time. I see a lot of messages in the chat. That'll be good to look at in just a minute. But here's a California vernal pool. And we love our vernal pools in California. Here's a water hole in Africa. See a similarity there? My question is, California and the Central Valley and Santa Rosa Plains and some other places like San Diego, we know that we had a lot of vernal pools during the Ice Age. There are Ice Age features that still continue where they haven't been developed. How could you have all these pools of water in early summer and have the megafauna not make use of them? Surely the mammoths got into those things and wallowed and drank water. It's hard to think otherwise. So that's one thought to hold on to. The other is, did some of those bison wallows and mammoth wallows actually become vernal pools? Is there a relationship between our megafauna and our vernal pools in California? Something to think about. Years ago, I flew over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and I was looking at the bomb craters below, and I had this idea. And I started researching what was going on in the Laotian Plain of Jars and how the indigenous people were making use of all these craters to grow fish and plants. And I realized if a bomb crater from a B-52 American bomb can hold water and become part of the environment, Why can't a bison or bison wallow or mammoth wallow? Here's a bison wallow on the plains. I've seen wallows like that on the Canadian plains still in existence. And they have a hard bottom often, and that's why they fill full of water when it rains. And then they slowly release that water, evaporation. But in the meantime, the animals can go there to drink. So maybe that's what we had. Maybe this vernal pool, this one's near Sacramento, maybe has a story that involves mammoth. I know of two vernal pools that have been investigated in the San Joaquin. They took backhoes through them back years ago. And in both cases, they found Rancho-La-Brea megafauna bones in the base of the vernal pools, mammoth and I think bison. So now going back to mammoth rocks, here's a terrible photograph I took with my first digital camera 24 years ago. And it's a telephoto, so it brings everything together. But look at what I call the depression there. That's about a 2-acre depression that stays green on into the summer before it browns up. I took a podologist out from Berkeley and we cored it years ago, and we got down 2 meters, and all we saw was a very ancient black clay. So what's the possibility this is the wallow that all these mammoth used that came here and polished these rocks? These rocks are heavily polished. Don't know that's the case, but it'd be interesting to look at. Our mammoths and bisons were our first landscape architects. And it's hard to imagine these large animals on the landscape without making changes and leaving evidence today. And they worked together. The bison, there were more bison than mammoths. They had very sharp hooves, and they aerate the soil when they walk across or run across. They break the soil up. And then the mammoths are the fertilizers. They drop their dung, which is rich with grass seed and sedge seed. And by working together, not intentionally probably, but by working together, they're ensuring lush pastures from year to year, other types of foods that they enjoy eating. One of my mentors, Dr. Stephen Edwards here, has looked at the landscape, and he says 70 million years of mammals grazing in California, that they have an effect on the flora. So the fauna and the flora are interconnected in prehistory. And he looks at the bunch grass and he looks at tarweed and says, are these evolutionary adaptations of plants trying to survive being trampled on or eaten by herds of mammoth and bison and all these others? And it makes sense. One's really sticky and hard to eat, and the other is a bunch grass. If you step on it, something still survives. It's a possibility. So Stephen talks about the grazing, browsing, trampling regime in California, which led to what we have as far as our flora. And I had pooping in there. I think pooping is an important part of that. Poopology is a really interesting part of our environment. And so if we have 140 big herbivores to every carnivore, there's going to be more herbivore poop out on the landscape. It's going to decompose faster, but it's still there for a while. It's not as much a threat as the carnivore poop as far as bacteria and parasites, but you still want to get rid of it. How did it get rid of? Well, I'll say that in just a minute. Here's the mammoth again. Hopefully you're seeing the mammoth now. Columbian mammoth is thought to have consumed a large mammoth, consumed between 500 and 750 pounds of food a day, mostly grasses and sedges. And they created between 300 and 500 pounds of poop a day. Now think about that. That's a lot of poop. There's something about the mammoth that you should be aware of. Like modern day horses, the mammoth and modern day elephants, African elephants, the mammoth was a hindgut feeder. It had a very poor way of digesting food. And because of that, it had to eat twice as much food as it was able to break down. So if you ever look at elephant dung, or horse dung, you'll find a lot of unprocessed, undigested vegetable fiber and sometimes seeds in that dung, as you can see here. So you've got the mammoths pooping on the ground, and you've got the bison tearing up the ground, and all of this unprocessed grass seed and sedge seeds going into the ground, which is a really cool thing. But in the meantime, you've also got all this dung on the ground. It's attracting flies. And this is where the dung beetle comes in. The dung beetle is my new hero. The dung beetle is another keystone species, just like the mammoth on the California Serengeti. And our dung beetles, these little tumblebugs here, were working really hard to dispose of all the dung. rolling it away, burying it, laying their eggs into it, uh, digesting it, consuming it. And there were a lot of dung beetles to do that because there was a lot of dung. Here's some dung beetles found at La Brea tar pits. There's a lot of beetles in La Brea tar pits, and these are the dung beetles. They were busy at work there. And we still have dung beetles in California. There's not as many now. On the right, you can see these locations, the red locations where they've been seen in recent years. There's one on the left there. Incredible, incredible insects. First of all, there's more beetles than any other insect in the world. And of the beetles, the dung beetle is probably the strongest insect or any type of life. Dung beetles thought to be able to move and lift 1,000 times its weight, to roll it 1,000 times its weight. And it had this symbiotic relationship with the megafauna because it's removing the dung so they can stay healthy. Because flies carry a lot of bad diseases. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, in the plains, we know that the bison historically had a relationship with the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs had large communities, and they did a lot of earth disturbance. And the bison would come there, they'll wallow in the dirt for their dry baths, and the bison would clip the grass and also urinate and defecate on it, making it richer the next year. The prairie dogs were happy because each year they got better grass to eat on, and also it helped their visibility. They could see predators if the bison have recently grazed there. I'm wondering, did our California ground squirrel play a similar role? In the Pleistocene, I would imagine we had a lot more California ground squirrel communities than we do today. We pretty much put a target on them today, and except in some state parks I've worked in, and an occasional house here and there, we don't see the numbers of California ground squirrels that I assume we once did. Is it possible that the California ground squirrel out on the California Serengeti had the same relationship with the bison herds? And it's a possibility. And we had scavengers in addition to dung beetles. The raven was a big scavenger. The vultures, including the condor, and the direwolves are thought to have been scavengers. And when you look at La Brea, you find a lot of ravens, number one bird you find there. You find a lot of direwolves. I think it's the number one big animal you find. You find a lot of dung beetles. And so they're doing a service by getting rid of all the waste. And waste can be the dung, and it can also be animal carcasses, partially eaten animal carcasses. So I think we owe the dung beetle and the condors a big thank you. And because they were there, they were able to maintain an ecological balance for years and years. So the flies didn't get carried away. So we know the dinosaurs probably disappeared at one time because of the big meteor strike 66 million years ago. But what about the megafauna? The best ideas are that there's a relationship between the disappearance of the megafauna and the arrival of humans. And it doesn't fit exactly one-to-one, but there does seem to be a relationship. But there's also a relationship between climate change, the end of the ice age, and then I would venture maybe even disease. And disease could be as simple as a hunting dog coming over out of North Asia into Alaska that had a flea that was diseased that got on a horse or a bison. So for sure, overhunting possibly, or just hunting possibly, and climate change especially, but maybe even disease is where they went, but we're not really sure. What we do know is that by 11,000 years ago, most of this large Rancho La Brea megafauna was gone. And the California Serengeti, as a unique ecological ecosystem, had collapsed. It was replaced by a new post-Pleistocene ecosystem that favored herbivores like elk and deer and predators like grizzly and cougar. All of those animals were here during the Rancho La Brea time, during the California Serengeti, but the bears had a different territory because of the presence of the short-faced bear out on the plains. The mountain lions did not compete with the California lions or the American lions. But as those animals disappeared, these animals that survived to this day moved into new niches and expanded their territory. So what does the future hold for the Russian River rivershed and for all the other living things that call this place home? And that includes you and me. What's our future look like? Well, getting back to the time machine, We took this time machine tonight and we went back 18,000 years so we could better understand what our area was like during the Ice Age. And it was a magnificent thing to see, all of these animals. Hopefully some of you will see them in your dreams tonight. But in just a minute, we're going to come back to the present. But I would venture to guess that if we take this machine out again someday, I propose that we go 150 years into the future. And the reason I say 150 years, that's actually the seventh generation. If starting today, you start thinking about people being born, that would be our first generation. And then the second and the third and fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. Seventh generation, more or less, will happen about 150 years from now. And I think we could go 150 years in the future, not run into Morlocks, hopefully. Hopefully there'll still be humans here. But I would be really interested to see what life is like in 150 years. Did we figure out some of the big questions? Did we rise to the occasion? Could the past ever inform the future? We've looked at how the Ice Age ended. We're kind of in between right now. The climate is crazy. We've had so many hot days this summer. I have friends that live in Tucson. I can't imagine over 100 days when it was over 100 degrees this year. And yeah, we can say it's always been hot, but it's hot longer now for more days. And that's what we have to be aware of. There's something going on with the climate, and it's having a lot of effects, and it's putting people into motion. We're going to have people migrating, just like the Sitka spruce had to migrate north when the Ice Age ended. We have people migrating north right now out of really hot areas that are becoming too arid to survive in. In 150 years, what will it look like? And so maybe we should, in the next year, come back together and let's take a look at 150 years from now and see what we think. I've been studying the mammoth and the elephant so long. This sounds crazy, but I'm beginning to feel like I think like them. And you probably know that an elephant brain is really close to a human brain, more so than most of the other animals. An elephant is born with a pretty undeveloped brain, which grows as they become older, just like our children. And it's being filled with history and love and art, conflict, maps and memory, poetry and dance. And as an elephant becomes older, they become very wise. And hopefully that's the same for us. But you know, I do think we study the past in order to learn from it. And the one thing I'd point out is that there's just one world. There's many, many people, but we have one world, and we have to be aware of time. I look at my clock now and I realize I'm right on schedule. I'm about to end this thing, but we all have to be aware of time. Some of you have heard of the seventh generation. Do you know that that concept came from the Iroquois Confederacy, a group of Native American tribes in northeastern U.S., including the Seneca and a number of other tribes. Years ago, and hopefully they still practice it, they codified into their constitution the seventh generation. And the idea was, if you make a decision, a personal decision, a decision at your dinner table, in your church, in your office, in your country, in your county, in your government, if you make a decision, try your best to make a decision that will benefit not only you and the people around you and the people of your time, but try to make a decision that will benefit the next 7 generations. If you can do that, you're giving a gift to the future that we won't be here to see, but people will be thankful. Does our generation have a moral obligation to the 7th generation? I think it does. I used to have another bumper sticker on my truck that said, think globally, act locally. And probably a lot of you remember that one. I believe in that, but you can't work all over the world. I suggest we all try our best to work within our communities. And the best way to work in your community is to work in your watershed. Right now, we're talking about the lower Russian River watershed, but there's a lot of other watersheds in our area. And find your watershed and find a group that takes volunteers or has membership, like the Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods or the Sonoma Ecology Center. I'm a board member of the Sonoma Ecology Center, or maybe Land Paths or Pepperwood or the Sonoma Land Trust, or any of these other great nonprofits that are striving to protect our environment and working one watershed at a time. Sign up, see what you can do to help. I think that's important. But this tonight has been a pleasure. I'm so honored to have presented on behalf of the Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods. It's a great organization. I remember when it was Stewards of the Slavianka, which was the old Russian word for the Russian River. A lot of people didn't know what that means. So years ago, they changed the name to the Coast and Redwoods, which makes a lot more sense. But there's their mission. And like I say, if you can check out the stewards, get involved with them. They put on a lot of really cool webinars and hikes. They're one of the most active organizations in our area, but we're blessed to live where we do because there's many others, Land Pass and the Sonoma Land Trust and all these others I mentioned earlier. Check them out, see what you can do. Well, I'm looking at the time and it's 8 o'clock. I think it's time to say goodbye to the Ice Age and return to September 30th, 2024. And I hope I can do that. I hope I can bring you all back. I've never left anybody behind, and I don't want to start tonight. So here we go. Are you ready? We did it. That's all I have right here. I have hopefully answers for your questions, and hopefully people enjoyed this. I'll wait for Lisa to join in. Stop my share.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Breck, for that very informative and insightful and encouraging presentation. And we've got a number of questions here, a lot of thank yous. And I saw early on, someone was asking you to say again something more maybe about the horses and the horses, coming from North America and where they moved.
Yeah, the horse originated in North America, actually in what's now our area. And understanding, if you look at the last 200 million years of geological history, the continents were like making themselves. So you can go to Berlin, Nevada, which is a state park, and you can see the fossil remains of Ictosauri, which was a big water reptilian dinosaur type of thing. Today it's in Nevada. But when those animals beached and died, they were down where Panama is today. And the continents were moving around, part of continental drift, and then pushed down underground and came back up, uplifted, and it suddenly found itself in Nevada, these fossils. And that's where they were discovered. So the horse goes back millions of years also. But just looking at the last, say, 20 million years, the area that they originated was the West, what's now would be the Western US. And they were smaller, different species. The one I showed you, the closest thing to what we had that survives today are the horses that you find on the steppes in Mongolia. And that looks like one of our predominant horses. And I think there's a genetic relationship. But we had other horses that went extinct, including, some small three-toed horses. I think they were you could go back 30 million years ago and find them here. I found a horse bone once, a fossil over Napa Valley in a park that I think I heard was 30 million years old. And it was a toe bone from a horse, one of those little small horses. So I know there's probably a lot of horse people in the crowd. You can go to the website for the Museum of Paleontology at the University of California, Berkeley, and find out more about fossil horses. You can also go to the La Brea tar pit website and find out more about fossil horses there. But there's probably a lot more known about the horses than the mammoths because we find so many of them. It's one of the most common fossils found along with bison. But they've been here a long time. They moved out of our area, crossed up through Alaska, went across, at least that's the theory. They could have taken a sailboat for all I know, but they crossed a land bridge into what's now North Asia and then spread through that part of the world. Were domesticated over there and it brought back 500 years ago by conquistadors, So they made this full circle, which is kind of interesting. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. That was great. And good references. And I'm seeing in the chat people asking if this is being recorded, which it is, and we will have it on our YouTube channel later this week. So fear not, you'll be able to rewatch it.
Thank you.
Someone is asking about pygmy mammoths, where there's such a thing in the California Serengeti.
We had we had pygmy mammoths on what are now the Channel Islands, which at the time were the Channel Islands weren't connected to the mainland. There was water, but it was a very narrow body of water separating like from the main islands. So the California coast went out further toward the Channel Islands, but the islands weren't necessarily connected. We had pygmy mammoths out there. We also had pygmy mammoths in northern Siberia, and we had them in the Mediterranean. And they're usually found in areas that get cut off from the rest of the world, and the mammoths get smaller for some reason. We say that the mammoths went extinct about 11,000 years ago, more or less. And that's based on what we found. So if in our area, I think there were 4 million mammoths at one time or another, not at the same time, but over the course of 2 million years that lived in our area. We've only probably found 50 of those. So when we say the mammoths have been extinct for 11,000 years, that means that the oldest mammoth that we found, or the youngest mammoth that we found, was 11,000 years ago. Someday we might find a mammoth that went extinct 8,000 years ago in our area. I doubt it, but we might. Well, if you go up to Wrangel Island in Siberia, northern Asia, there were mammoths as recently as 4,000 years ago up there, but they were the pygmy mammoths. And I can't remember the ones on the Channel Island. There was a scientist named Phil Orr from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History that did a lot of work on Santa Rosa Island with the dwarf mammoths. And I think there's some publications. If you go to the website for the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, or probably the UCLA Museum of Natural History, you'll probably find something on those mammoths.
I think you may have answered this one, but someone is asking, did the Farallon Plain have an equivalent in Southern California that extends out to the Channel Islands?
Probably. I haven't looked at that. I think you can find, well, I wouldn't call it the Farallon down there. I'd call it something else because, obviously we have the Farallon Islands up here. But for an example, what's that Dodger land in the UK and Ireland? There was a vast piece of land that extended out into the North Sea that's now underwater. And that must have been an impressive environment because fishermen, when they drag their nets on the bottom of the sea, they're constantly pulling up ice age fossils. They're like 200 feet or 200 miles offshore. Or, you can go to our East Coast and look at how deep the ocean is. You could probably have gone out 200 miles if you were in Virginia or Maryland or Florida into the Atlantic when the ocean was at lowest. You could have gone out there. So what I'm calling the Farallon, or what I'm calling Farallon Plain and the Serengeti, probably was duplicated many places around the country where you have this coastal environment. What makes this kind of unique is that we have the combination of an interior, what I call a pasture, and a coastal pasture. And then that triggers the possibility of going back and forth, maximizing your carrying capacity by moving to the coast during summer and back into the interior during winter. Some of those areas, probably Florida, definitely Maryland, that area could have done the same thing, I think. The Channel Islands, there would have been something. I've not looked at the bathymetric data and the geological data to see how far out the ocean drops off, but I know it came close to the Channel Islands, and that's a good little ways out. I just don't know what the interior would have looked like, but it's doable. Maybe someone in this group will look into that, or maybe someone in this group has a nephew or a niece or a child or a neighbor who they'll encourage to look into it, and we'll have some future paleontologists, and then we'll be providing for that first generation and hopefully the seventh.
Speaking of the rocks specifically, someone is asking, did the polished rocks originally come from volcanoes? What kind of rock is that?
Yeah, we have 3 types of rocks in our area. We have sedimentary rocks made under the sea under pressure. We have metamorphic rocks, which are kind of like a little bit of everything put together and then under pressure and heat. And then we have the igneous rocks, and those are our volcanics. Our volcanic rocks are called the Sonoma volcanics, and they're 7 to 9 million years old. Our sedimentary rocks are the Franciscan Formation, and they're over 90 to 100 million years old, back to even more than that. And then the metamorphic are very similar. Metamorphic rocks are like sedimentary rocks that got all changed. And that's what we have out on the coast. The rocks I call the mammoth rocks. And to be perfectly honest, when I came up with the word mammoth rock site, it was tongue in cheek. And it was partly because these rocks are so big. They're the biggest rocks out on the coast. But the name stuck and it's kind of nice. And I still call them sunset rocks sometimes and mammoth rocks other times. But those rocks are schist. They're a type of schist, which is a metamorphic rock. Down the road at Jasper Rock, that beautiful red polished rock I showed you, that's a chert. That's a Franciscan chert. So two different rocks, similar age, very different depositional history.
Thank you. And there may be people that are not as familiar with this area. And do you want to say any more about the location of these rocks and how to access them?
It's an iffy question. I talk about the Mammoth Rock site because the word got out. And I didn't actually publicize it, but I was out there doing an excavation. People found out, and the press found out. So I figure everybody knows about that one. And the more we know, the better we can protect it. And that's been the case out there. There's some other rocks that are harder to let people go to because I think they're more vulnerable. That's especially the case if you're talking about, rock art, indigenous rock art. We almost never talk about locations unless it's a site that's protected, like the Painted Caves in Santa Barbara. These rocks, they don't have the same threat, but I'm always worried people are going to go out and take rock samples. And that's happened in the past. That was what was going on at the mammoth rocks before I found the polish, because it's such a unique rock. In geology, field classes come from all over to see the rocks in that area. And over the years, people had taken samples. Now, every now and then, someone will go out there and see a scar and say, oh my God, people are finding out about the rocks and they're coming and taking souvenirs. So far, I'm happy to say that the scars I've seen when I go out to investigate are the old ones I photographed 25 years ago. But I'd hate to have that happen. So if you go out to the rocks, leave your rock hammer at home. Don't hurt the rocks because they have a story that we don't know yet. There's so much that we can find out from them. But the Mammoth Rock site is out near Goat Rock. And it's where you turn off Highway 1 to go to Goat Rock. You'll see it. There's two large rock stacks sitting down on the coastal terrace. One's about 100 feet tall, and it reminds me of Shiprock, New Mexico. And the other is about 60 feet tall. It reminds me of a destroyed or a cathedral in ruins. There are all these spires breaking apart. And that's the one that has most of the polish. There's a lot of other smaller rocks up and down the coast that I've looked at that have polish, but nothing like the big rock. So the good thing is that the rock that's the easiest accessible, that people know about, no one says you can't go look at it, with certain caveats, is the Mammoth Rock site. And that's where you'll find the polish. And if you go there, walk around all the way around the rock, but especially the leeward side where animals were out of the wind, and look at all the overhangs and anywhere a large animal could get without falling down over a rock scatter. So all the accessible rock faces, especially if they're at an incline like an overhang, you'll see they're heavily polished. When you look at the polish, a lot of the lower polish is going to be jet black. In fact, you can see yourself in some of it. As you go up the rock higher, over like 7 or 8 feet, all the way up to 13 feet, it becomes a very dull, grayer polish. And what's happening is that in the last 100 years, at the ranch that used to be out there, we had cows and horses and sheep. They rubbed the rock. They re-rubbed the old Pleistocene rubs. And that's why it's so black. The lower ones probably have a lot of lanolin in them from the history of sheep. But as you go up higher, you'll see the older rubs. They're slowly being colonized by lichens. And lichen eats the polish. So there's some faces that are, you can just see some of the polish. If we came back in probably 10,000 years, maybe 50,000 years, it'll be hard to see the polish because the lichens will have completely covered them. And in doing so, will have eaten the polish itself. So something to think about.
I'm wondering if anyone else has any more questions. I think I might have seen one. Let's see. Someone was asking about the size of the animals and why they were so much larger in that period,
You
18,000
know,
years.
that's a really good question, and I don't have the answer. I'm sure it's been speculated about. Same thing, why were there such large dinosaurs, you know? Um, Possibly diet. There's places, there's places in the world that in recent times, since World War II, have embraced more of an American or a Western diet, including things like fast food. And you can look at the stature of high school students in those areas and see that they're getting taller and heavier over time by eating a more fat-rich, uh, going from a traditional diet that was heavily based on rice and fish to where you're getting, a lot of fast food and higher carb count, and people are actually getting bigger. Uh, so diet's really important to size. Brown bears, I've hiked with brown bears in Siberia, and I've hiked with them in Alaska. And in Alaska, you get the grizzlies inland, and you get the big Kodiak bears on Kodiak Island. The Kodiak brown bears are substantially larger than the grizzlies you'll run into at places like Denali or Kenai Peninsula. And the reason is that the bears at Denali are eating roots and tubers and mice and berries. But the bears on Kodiak Island, and like the bears in Kamchatka, Siberia, are eating a lot of salmon. And a salmon diet is it's going to make you bigger and healthier and stronger over the years. And I think that's working. That was working with these animals. Someone just asked a question about Native American. I'm glad you did that because I had a note to mention that. I intentionally didn't get into indigenous residency within the California Serengeti, but believe me, there were people out there. And how far back in time, I don't know. I think at least 20,000 years based on that one site. And I haven't published that data yet. And I'm not certain that my date is right. The date's right, but what I'm finding deep down may or may not be cultural. I happen to think it is, but hopefully in a few years, I'll think that through, or someone else will. But I think people have been out there at least 20,000 years. If people have been out there at least 20,000 years, they've probably been out there 30,000 years because of the math. If you can be there 20, you can be there 30. Once you can be there earlier, 13,000. We used to think that people came down through an ice-free corridor. We know there were other ways now, what they call the Kelp Highway, coming along the shore. But people were out there. I don't know a lot about those people. We haven't seen a lot of that history. And so next year, a good friend of mine, some of you know Greg Castro. Greg and I are talking about doing a webinar and for somebody talking about the California Serengeti, but putting people into that environment. And Greg's a Salinan man, native man. And a scholar. He's going to take the lead in talking about people, and I'll take the lead in talking about the megafauna. And we're going to put it together as a presentation and try to better understand what life was like for the people living on the California Serengeti 20,000 years ago, surviving in grace with these large bears and lions, and doing well enough that they survived. That all these other tribes we know today are here. So give me a year and we'll work on that.
There's a question here about wondering if redwood forests were spread further 20,000 years ago than they are now.
They were. And here's why I know that. In Sebastopol, over on the Laguna, just on the east side of Sebastopol, years ago, someone told me they were drilling a well. I think it was Weeks Drilling, was drilling a well, and they got down about 120 feet, and they found redwood. Just like the wood I found from the Sitka spruce, it looked just like redwood, but it was 105 feet down. So today, that's the Laguna. But the laguna's there because the ice age ended, you know. There was a stream in what's now the laguna, but just like San Francisco Bay was different during the ice age, I think the Laguna de Santa Rosa looked very different during the ice age. And there were redwoods coming down out of Sebastopol. They may not have gone all the way across to Santa Rosa, but they were on the periphery there. And then another friend of mine recently told me that she and her husband had to do a well a few years ago, and they live in Bennett Valley. If you can place Bennett Valley, those that aren't from here, Bennett Valley is the southern part of Santa Rosa. It's sort of a valley surrounded by some of our mountains. And they also had to drill a well, and they got down something like 100, 200 feet, I think, and they found redwood. These are areas that now don't have redwood, you know, so it's more oak woodland and but there was redwood there. So we had more redwood at one time um, than we do now. So what does that mean? I don't know. I'd love to work with someone, you know, paleobotanist, um, and just see what the distribution might have looked like. I've done some brainstorming, and I've imagined being a bison going from, you know, Valley of the Moon, where I live, out to the coast. And what would you see? Is you came out of the Mayacamas, you would see pine forests and redwood forests, and you'd cross these valleys. And I think a lot of our valleys were grasslands because of the presence of the mammoth. But by the time you got out to the coast, I'm almost certain it was grassland because this was a young environment that the trees were trying to grow on the Farallon Plain at the same time the mammoth were trying to colonize it. And elephants today are hard on young trees, really hard. So I'm trying to picture Sitka spruce, Monterey pine, and redwood trying to get a stand on the Farallon Plain while all these mammoths are coming back every year and rooting them up. So it's more likely that the Farallon Plains was grass and sedge. The interior valleys, like the Franciscan Valley, what's now under San Francisco Bay, was almost certainly a grassland based on the fossils that were found when they did the bridges. You get up on the Santa Rosa Plain, I'm pretty sure that was a big grassland savanna environment based on the fossils. But in between, I'm not sure. And we should have had some pretty dense redwood stands, I would think, on the west side of Sebastopol, uh, the west side of Santa Rosa. And where they came together, I'm not sure. Hopefully that helps.
Was and kind of along those lines, someone's asking about the trees that were in those times. Would we recognize them now? And I'm sort of reading into that. Are there trees that are no longer here? You mentioned a few.
Yeah. If you went back, I've done a lot of interpretation at Sugarloaf Ridge State Park. And I like to talk about the Miocene forest, but it could be the Miocene forest in any part of the North Bay. If you went back 30,000 years ago and took a walk in the Miocene forest instead of the Pleistocene, you would see some of the same trees we have now, but you'd also find avocado trees. And one of the biggest animals you'd have to watch out for was the rhino. So 30 million years makes a big difference. Looking at our trees and our forests, from what I understand, in talking to paleobotanists, is that the modern present day forest has been pretty much the same for about 2 million years during the Pleistocene. The boundaries have changed a little bit and the numbers of this tree versus that tree. But as far as, you know, a black oak versus a redwood versus, you know, a manzanita, we have the same plants. We've had them for a couple million years. So during the time of this California Serengeti, we pretty much had the same forests we had. We pretty much had the same grasslands we have today, but the boundaries were different. And that's what changed over time. And boundaries were based partly on the climate because, you know, it was still an ice age. It was cooler. Today, you don't find Monterey pine. I found 7 Monterey pine cones at Sugarloaf in Sonoma Creek years ago during a storm. It washed out a paleobotanical site, and I found redwood and dug fir cones, but I found 7 Monterey pine cones. I dated them to about 25,000 years ago. Today, we consider Monterey pine an exotic in our area, but here they were part of the forest 25,000 years ago. Something happened as the ice age ended and the Pleistocene became the Holocene. the Monterey pine had to leave. They shrunk their territory down to the Monterey Peninsula. At the same time, the Sitka spruce was shrinking back to the north because of climate. And we're slowly seeing that happening right now with global climate change. We're seeing species shrinking in their territory or relocating if they can walk away. And we're seeing people do that as well for the same reason.
Well, and we are almost at our time boundary here. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us, Breck, or?
I just encourage people to get involved with groups like yours, Lisa. I've been looking at the heat around the world this year, and there's a lot of reason to be concerned. My friend Bernie Krause does the soundscapes, and he's been recording bird sound at Sugarloaf for 30 years in the same place. And the last 2 years, it's been pretty quiet. And it could be because, the forest fires we've had, could be development and habitat loss, could be climate change. It's something. And we hear less birds singing at Sugarloaf now. Hopefully they're singing in your backyards. But we've already lost so many of our songbirds over the years. To think that we can lose more is just kind of sad. But at the same time, I talked about how I used to clean my windshield every time I put gas in my car to get the bugs off. I don't do that anymore. I don't see the bugs that we used to have. So get involved, and let's make a difference, but not just for ourselves, but for those next 7 generations. And if we do that, we'll feel better. We may not see the result, but we'll feel better about ourselves. And people in the future are going to look back. And if they have a time machine by then, they're going to come back and thank us. I guarantee you. If we don't do it, who will? And if you're interested in the Pleistocene and mammoths and bison, yeah, it's cool to be curious about that. But what can we use that knowledge to do? Can we better understand extinction and climate change and habitat loss and try to make a difference in our own neighborhoods? And if you're going to do that, work in your watershed. That's the very best place to work, which takes me back to why people should consider getting involved with you, Lisa and Justin, or any of these other great organizations I mentioned earlier in our area. Try to make a difference.
Thank you so much. I think you made a huge difference to a lot of people this evening. Many thanks for your time and your research and all your work and taking an evening to share with us.
It was really good. And if my friend Lester Panola is in the audience, I wore this for you. This is my acorn necklace that my friend Lester gave me at a talk recently. And it just felt like a good night to wear it. This has been an honor, and believe me, I feel so privileged and happy to do this. And to be honest, I'm glad we're done now because I'm going to go get a big drink of water and stop talking.
And
But
thank you, everybody, so much for joining us this evening.
And you'll let us know when you have the link on YouTube so we can all share it.
Sure will.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody still out there. This was fun and an honor. I'm pretty easy to find. And if you can't find me, you can find me through Lisa. And if anybody has a pressing question that you think of later, you can always send it to me. And I'd love to engage and talk. So get your question or message or even your criticism to me, and I'll respond. I like doing that.
Okay. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Good night.
Take care.